So welcome to our Managing Weeds in Grasslands and Rangelands webinar this morning. We're going to be starting right at 9 and continuing through about 12 p.m. I'm your moderator today, and I'll be doing my best to keep us on schedule. So just a few notes before we get started. We are recording the webinar for educational or promotional use. But no one that is an attendee will be showing up on the screen. So all attendees are muted and no one can see your video. We ask that attendees please post your questions in the Q&A. You should be able to see it at the bottom of your Zoom panel. If you have comments, you can use the chat for comments, but we ask that if you have questions again for the speakers in particular, that you put them in the Q&A. To receive your CEUs, we ask that you stay in the webinar for the entire duration. There are no partial credits given during webinars, a little different than live meetings. You have to answer the poll questions. There'll be poll questions after each of the talks, and you have to answer those, at least try, do your best. We'll talk about the answers to those as we go. For CCA credits, there'll be a QR code at the end of the meeting, or you can reply to the post-webinar email as well. For DPR credits, so QAL, QAC, PCA, etc., you need to follow the instructions for the final exam. It'll be sent right after the webinar in an email, and you need to get a 70% or better to receive CEUs. So our agenda for the day, I'm doing our little welcome here. We'll start in about another 10 minutes or so. Our first speaker will be Rebecca Ozeran from 9:10 to 9:35. Valerie Ebner is our second speaker. At 10 o'clock, we'll hear from Debbie Rao, and then we'll have a little break. And during the break, apologize, I will give you guys some instructions on what to do during the break. We'll rejoin at 10:35 to hear from Tom Getz. After that, we'll hear from Chris McDonald at 11 and Scott Onetto at 11:25. We're going to do our best to stay on time today, and we should end by about noon, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers if folks have a few at the end. Okay, our speaker lineup for the day, the folks that you're going to hear from in a moment. Rebecca Ozeran. Rebecca will be speaking about rangelands, fire and weeds, an ecological overview. Valerie Ebner. Valerie will be speaking about grassland management to influence fire severity and post-fire recovery in California. Debbie Rao, prescribed fire and herbicides to control yellow star thistle. Tom Getz will be speaking about controlling winter annual grasses on rangelands of Northern California and implications for fire management. Chris McDonald will be speaking about weeds and grasslands, fire, fuels, and restorations. And Scott Onetto will finish up the webinar with managing invasive grasses in annual rangelands. And just a thank you before we get started here. So the UC Weed Research and Information Center with Gail Perez have done most of the footwork for putting on this webinar. And of course, we all have industry partners and collaborators that help us with our research, and UCCE and UC Davis staff and students. And of course, the biggest thank you goes to our California growers and ranchers, who without all of you, we would not be able to do this research. So thanks everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so our first speaker is Rebecca Ozeran. Rebecca is a livestock and natural resource advisor with UCCE Fresno and Madera counties. So Rebecca, go ahead and share whenever you're ready.
All right, I'm also testing. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm using my phone, so hopefully it'll have better continuity of sound than my Wi-Fi typically does. So I will share my screen. All right, it might take a minute to get full screen. Is that full screen for everybody?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. All right, so yes, good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. My name, again, is Rebecca Ozeran. I am a Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor with Cooperative Extension in Fresno and Madera, as Whitney shared. And I'm going to start us off today with a brief overview of some of the ecological interactions of rangelands, fire, and weeds in California. So the overview today is going to be some of the basics of fire impacts to plant communities. I'll talk a little bit about historically fire-adapted plant communities. I'll talk about fire-adapted weeds and some of the principles of controlling them, and then I'll share some resources at the end if you have further questions. So right after a fire comes through, there are some immediate impacts, and then long-term, depending on the frequency of fire, there can be lasting impacts. So the immediate impact of a fire, as I've got these photos here, is that you can turn something like a grassland into what we might consider a blank slate, where there are abundant resources. That black char on the ground has a lot of nutrients. There's no more shading of the soil surface, and so there's abundant sunlight for new plants to grow. And there's little competition because all of the plants that had been there are no longer present to compete for those resources. Now, over time, I've got this series of arrows that we aren't always guaranteed the same outcome from a fire, and it depends, again, on the frequency of the fire and the type of fire that's coming through our landscape. So when we look at that blank slate, even just in that immediate outcome, we've got this combination of high resources. So although it looks like a blank slate from the surface of the soil, there are, again, a lot of resources, and there may be a lot of propagules or seeds or vegetative parts of plants that can reproduce and colonize the bare area. So the species that come back right after a burn will depend on what was there before. So those dominant pre-fire species, any species that are in areas that did not burn, that are bordering burn, and then anything that may not have been as obvious before, but may have been stimulated to grow because of the heat or the smoke from the fire itself. So right after a fire, we're going to get some sort of new growth, but it might be a new community. And in particular today, we're concerned it might be a new community that's dominated by weeds. Weeds love the blank slate. They're highly competitive, and they will take advantage of those resources better than a lot of our desired species. So I've got this image of a rangeland in Madera County, and this is a photo of how it looked, a little zoomed in from the earlier example, right after a burn in 2017. And it might be a little hard to see, but in the background, if you can see my cursor, the burn extended out almost to this pond. And so the foreground of this area is really looking at the middle of a large burned area. And so in this burned area, again, that black char is a lot of resources, and there's nothing else that survived on the ground surface to compete for resources. And so this could be primed for a weed invasion. Now here's another example after a fire in Mendocino County. These were shared also in 2018. It also burned in 2017. And you can see a different kinds of responses to a fire on the same property. So this first photo shows in the foreground, there is a grass that did repopulate the area that burned. You can tell by the black charred trees that this was a pretty severe burn, and it killed all of the trees. Some of them may be resprouting. We have a few shrubs and forbs that are coming back, but mostly it's the grasses. And unfortunately, this grass is considered an invasive species. This was knit grass, and it's not what the rancher hoped to come back. Now, on the same property, we have very different experiences in different sites. So luckily for them, in the foreground here, you'll notice there's no grass. That means that the knit grass probably didn't have any seeds in this area of the property, and so the natural shrubs and forbs that were there before, and some of the trees are what's coming back. In the background on the hillside, you can see that there is grass, and that's actually from an aerial seeding project that was done, and that was with Italian ryegrass, which was a desired forage species. So you can see that there's a mosaic of what happens on the landscape, and again, the weed control issue can be really important. So in general, rangelands in California have had a long history with fire. There have been millennia of weather ignitions from lightning and wind, and human ignitions, both intentional and unintentional, for many, many years. The severity and the duration of the fire varied across the landscape, And so this resulted over time in these different fire histories in our different ecosystems. And today I'm going to give a very brief insight into grasslands, chaparral, and deserts in California. Now, keep in mind, while I'm talking about these ecosystems, there's also fire adaptation at an individual plant level. The adaptations at the individual level contribute to the overall community's response to a fire. And so I'm going to include two key topics about plant responses and plant adaptations that I'll be referencing in the next few slides. The first one is the principle of avoidance. This is essentially a way that a plant avoids the harmful impacts of fire to itself. In many cases in California, this would be an annual grass that produces its seed, drops its seed, and senesces or dies in the spring, long before the fire comes through the area to burn it. And so there's no living plant matter on the grass to be harmed, and the seeds are typically safe on the soil surface. So in that way, it avoids the impact of fire. On the other side, there are fire-tolerant species, such as oaks, which can either withstand the heat of a fire or can recover after being damaged. And so I've got some photos on the right here where the oak on the top might have thick enough bark to withstand the heat of a grass fire, whereas on the bottom, you can see this oak is actually resprouting after a fire came in and destroyed the above ground material. And so there's avoidance, which just avoids the damage entirely, and tolerance, which can come back after damage. So we'll start with the grasslands and oak woodlands. These are very well adapted to fire. As I mentioned, most of our grasses in California are good at avoiding the negative impacts of fire. Our forbs, or broadleaf plants like clovers and fillory, also love to come in and populate burned areas because they can take advantage of the resources that are available when the grasses are no longer shading them out. And as I mentioned, oaks often will survive or resprout after a fire. So in these systems, we actually have positive uses of fire, such as oak management to do pest control on the acorn. We can absolutely use fire as a weed control tool in these systems, and it can be used as a fuel reduction tool, especially as we're having more communities living in these systems. The second system I want to talk about briefly is chaparral, which is our shrub-dominated system. This is also very well fire adapted, but at a different time scale than our grasslands. Our grasslands, with their finer fuels, are adapted to burning every maybe 5 to 30 years, whereas chaparral, those shrubs, are better adapted to burning every 50 to 100 years. The shrubs take a lot longer to regrow and regenerate after a fire than the grasses do. So these shrubs are adapted in terms of tolerance, not avoidance. The shrubs don't simply go to sleep and come back after a fire. They're typically living year-round, and so they're better able to resprout or to germinate from seeds on the soil surface. So in these systems, fire can also be used for constructive uses, such as to change the species composition, often used for ranching in actually reducing the amount of shrub cover by doing fire more frequently than the chaparral can tolerate, and that might ultimately shift the population away from chaparral and into a grassland system. And again, it can be used for field reduction or weed control, but has to be kept in mind that the frequency of fire that these shrubs can tolerate is much less than a grassland can tolerate. Finally, I do want to talk about California deserts, specifically thinking about those types of deserts with things like Joshua trees or cacti. These systems are mostly not fire adapted. They evolved with a very infrequent fire history, and the structure of these systems means that if a lightning bolt strikes one Joshua tree, there was typically nothing in between Joshua trees to connect them and to carry a fire. And so maybe one tree would die from a lightning strike, and that would be the end of the fire. This is one system where invasive grasses like medusa head and cheatgrass are a huge threat to the native biodiversity, because these new grasses are able to populate in between the existing native vegetation and carry a flame from one to the next. And unfortunately, these native trees and cacti are typically not able, they typically don't tolerate or avoid the impacts of fire, and they typically will die. So in these systems, historically, there was little beneficial use for fire, and now there may only be beneficial uses if we can find a way to use prescribed burning to reduce those invasive annual grasses. So hopefully from these brief overviews of the ecosystems, you've gotten some ideas of the challenges of weeds and fire in California. As I mentioned, weeds love a blank slate, and so after a fire is a very important time to do weed control because they might be better primed to take over your landscape than when there were a dense canopy of trees, shrubs, or grasses. Some other challenges of weeds in these systems is that many have fire-adapted characteristics, and I'll share a little bit more about that later. And as I do want to point out, a lot of these weeds also have similar and competitive biology to our desirable plants. So this photo on the bottom here shows Medusa head in the mix with several other dry annual grasses, just to highlight that at a certain point of the year, they're almost indistinguishable from one another in terms of how flammable they are and their impact to the ecosystem. So now we'll shift into some more details on how these weeds interact with fire. I'm going to describe kind of generally grasses, forbs or broadleaf plants, and woody species. I'm not going to go into the identification of these species, but if you have questions about identification, we have a great statewide network who can help. And I do want to point out on the woody species, I have included Himalaya blackberry, although it's typically a bigger issue in riparian or wet areas because it needs a lot more water than many of these other weeds in California. So keeping in mind, again, as you'll probably hear throughout the day today, that your control options have different costs in terms of actual money, your time and labor, as well as the timing in which they're most effective and the success rate that you'll have depending on the species of the weed that you're working with. So we really encourage you to know what you have so that you can take the right control approach. So some of the principles of controlling grasses, I'm sharing some of the features or the target points that we can think about, and then also the challenges of each of these kinds of plants. So the features of grasses is that they rely significantly on seed production to survive. And this means that we can effectively target seed production as the one time in their life that we want to stop them from producing. And so this can help us a lot with planning the timing of our control. Another feature of grass is that they are pretty small and delicate relative to some of our other species. And so this means we have a lot of treatment options, including grazing, burning, mechanical, and chemical options. These are the most flexible in terms of control options, but of course they also have their own challenges. One of the biggest challenges of these grasses, which you'll hear a lot more about later this morning, is that these grasses overlap a lot with desirable plants. You might see on the bottom left photo, I've got some red brome, which is that purple colored grass, but in the background and the foreground, there's also wild oats, and they're producing seeds at essentially the same time. And so controlling just one of those species can be very difficult to not harm your non-target desired species. Other challenges of grasses include their long-lived seeds, that you might have years of seeds built up in the soil, and a one fire might trigger germination of one set, but there will probably be more to deal with for a few years. The seed heads themselves make them less palatable and less grazable later in the season. So all of these photos kind of show most of these undesirable species have long awns that can be physical deterrents to grazing. And finally, although their small texture makes them have many options for control, it also means that they're a good fuel for fire. And so grasses, as I mentioned in the desert system, can actually increase the likelihood of a fire coming through and can increase the fire frequency. And to their benefit, these plants typically avoid the impact of fire. And so they can create these positive feedback loops where they propagate themselves and exclude other species. Now, this is a large table, and I don't expect you to remember any of this. I'll be happy to share my slides. This is just to show how these different grass species have multiple different control types that you can consider in your toolbox, and that mechanical, burning, grazing, and herbicide are all options at different times in these plant systems, plant life cycles, excuse me. So we'll move on to the forbs. Again, those tables will be available to you after. Don't worry about the details right now. The features of forbs is that they tend to be a lot more distinctive than a grass. If you're driving past a pasture, you might be able to detect the bright purple flower on a thistle or the bright yellow of fiddleneck on the right there, but you probably couldn't tell from a distance whether you have Medusa head, barred goat grass, or wild oats growing in your pasture. And so this benefit of having that distinctive appearance, often very interesting looking leaves or stems, means that you're able to identify these plants faster and come up with a treatment plan sooner. Another benefit of forbs is that they often have a large leaf area. And so this can mean that either they'll be more palatable to grazing, as there's higher protein content in broader leaves than there is in grass, for instance. And it also might mean that you have a larger target area for chemical applications. And finally, another feature which relates back to that distinctive appearance is the flower phenology can tell you at what stage of life this plant is. and can make it, again, easier to target the right time for applying your treatment technique. Of course, forbs also have challenges. Most importantly, they have a lot of grazing deterrents. And so those can include physical deterrents like the spines on that milk thistle on the top left. And they also include chemical deterrents, which can be considered toxins, such as the puncture vine in the middle of this slide and the fiddleneck on the right. And so this can mean that grazing becomes less of an option to control a lot of our forbs. Forbs are also challenging to deal with because they have a dual reproductive strategy. Many of them will be able to produce by seeds as well as vegetative spread. And so then you have to deal with root and stem systems being long-lived or regrowing, as well as the longevity of seeds in the seed bank. So I know, again, this is a huge table. This is, again, just to summarize the different options that are available for these kinds of plants. You'll notice that prescribed fire and grazing become less of options with our forbs, but mechanical and herbicide options are still pretty effective. And it, of course, depends on the timing and the specific species you're dealing with. So again, don't worry about memorizing any of this. Slides will be available. All right, our last plant type is going to be those woody species, including vines, shrubs, and trees. The features of these species is they tend to be highly visible. They're usually the largest kinds of plants we have. You'll be able to tell if you have, for instance, a tree of heaven in the middle of a pasture or a pile of Himalaya blackberry in your riparian area, pretty far away from them. Another benefit of these species, possibly excepting that blackberry, is that they tend to have slower population growth than, for instance, our grasses. If you have 10 grass plants this year, they create thousands of seeds. You might have 1,000 grass plants next year. You're less likely to have 10 trees this year and then 1,000 trees next year, depending on their reproductive mechanism. And so you might be able to have better, longer lasting impacts of successful treatments on these woody species to give you more time to come back and do a second treatment. Of course, again, there are always challenges. Woody species especially have good root systems, often tap roots, and sometimes rhizomes or longer stem systems. Again, of course, these are the largest plants that we're going to be dealing with, so you might need heavy equipment if you prefer to use mechanical removal, unlike with grasses where you don't always need heavy equipment. And the protective bark can mean that you need to have unique ways of applying herbicides if you're going to use chemical options, and it typically means that you won't be able to use grazing on these species either. So again, here are the woody species summarized in a table. Again, you'll notice grazing pretty much falls away as an option. Mechanical can be an option. Prescribed fire can help in terms of being combined with a second method, and then herbicides tend to be the fallback method for these plants. So in summary, I do want to bring us back to this picture just to share an actual success story that this photo of the burned area was actually before the photo of the grass. And so we got very fortunate that in this case, it was in the middle of the burn. There was no edge pressure from weeds. There had been years of consistent management, and so the seed bank was entirely these wild oats and some fillery, both of which were desired species on that property. And it meant that the things that were available were what came back, and they were predictable based on what had been done in the past. But this isn't always the case, and so we definitely encourage avid weed management and monitoring after fires because those are a very vulnerable point in time. So I do want to share resources very briefly. The Weed Control in Natural Areas book is a fantastic resource. You can get it online or buy it through your local cooperative extension office if they're open. The Weed Research and Information Center has good identification resources and other tools. And the Fish and Wildlife Service actually created a guide a few years ago on fire management and invasive plants, and it's a free PDF that you can download. So thank you. I'm happy to answer questions now.
Rebecca, you have two questions. The first one is, why is annual ryegrass a desired species? It is non-native and invasive.
That's a great question. So when you're thinking about reseeding a pasture, it 100% depends on what your goals are. In the case that I shared where they had seeded Italian rye or annual ryegrass, I believe their primary concern was erosion management and grazing ability, and it is a very palatable species, and so it was probably the best option for those two goals.
Sorry, wasn't unmuted there. The other question is, can you repeat the fire frequency in shrub versus grass ecosystems?
Yeah, so typically speaking, in the grassland systems, it's estimated that the natural fire frequency, whether considering lightning or human ignitions on purpose, they're adapted to between 5 and 30 years in between burns. But the chaparral systems, those shrub systems, are better adapted to 50 to 100 years in between burns.
Okay, and the last question is, can we have a link to that table, please?
Yes, so I will either, you can post my slides, Whitney, or we can find a way for me to get those tables out to everybody a different way.
Okay.
And I will say,
oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, those are based on information in the Weed Control and Natural Areas Handbook. So that's a great resource.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. If we do end up posting, everyone, we will email out to all the attendees afterwards. And then we'll go ahead and launch the poll really quickly, give everybody a chance to answer. And then once everyone has answered, Rebecca, you can address some of the incorrect answers. Okay, here we go.
Great.
Okay, attendees, you should be able to see the poll. So go ahead and answer. These polls you're not being graded on. This is just participation. So it doesn't matter if you get it wrong or right. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Okay. Okay, so everyone should be able to see the results now.
Okay. Yeah, looks like most everybody got the first one correct. You do have to worry about weeds after a fire. They will take advantage of those resources that are available, especially the sunlight and the nutrients that are freed up and the lack of competition. They're highly competitive species. So false was the correct answer for number 1. Number 2, which of the following communities was not adapted to fire? Everybody, desert is definitely not adapted to fire the way that all of these other species have. So grasslands, chaparral, and oak woodlands are all okay with some free fire, and their species can come back or avoid the incident, but deserts typically do not have species that can avoid or come back after a fire. And number 3, what is most likely to increase fire frequency? You are correct. Grasses are absolutely the most likely to increase fire frequency because they increase the continuity of fire on the landscape as soon as there is some kind of ignition. They tend to be a little more separated from one another, and so increase the fire impact or how hot it burns, but they're not necessarily going to increase the frequency. Are there any other questions?
Okay, I see one more in the Q&A. Do you have an example of a chaparral community that has used prescribed fire to alter species composition with success?
You know, I don't think I can list any specific areas, but I do know shrub-dominated communities have been burned to reduce the presence of shrubs and convert them into a more grazable habitat. So maybe some of our other speakers today would have specific examples.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca. Oh, we've got one more. Okay, we've still got a little time, so it's okay. CAL FIRE seems to encourage grass versus shrubs for fire management. Do you know why? Thank you.
That's a great question, and I would definitely suggest asking your local CAL FIRE group what they typically think. My guess would be that Grasses, although they can increase the fire frequency, they tend to burn more quickly and at lower temperatures than shrubs. They're less hazardous to buildings, and they're easier to manage, for instance, around a home or around a barn than shrubs, which could burn very hot and cause a also burn down. And so it might just be and the amount of effort it takes to put out the fire rather than the frequency of fire that they're focusing on.
Okay, and one more question. What are the best ways to control wild oats? Grazing, timing?
You know, that's a great question. Typically, wild oats is a desired species on our rangelands, although it is tends to be highly palatable. And so in grazed systems, it will be grazed. And there are probably times that you could increase it to reduce its seed production. Specific questions in your system, I would definitely recommend contacting a local person, either cooperative extension office, probably would be a good place to start, and they can help you make a management plan for getting rid of it if you want to get rid of it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca.